Well, welcome back to Straight Shoot News, and the first in our series on this New Year special, The Awakening, the Beginning. So now we're going to take a deeper dive from what we left off with Operation Paperclip and all the other CIA operations involved around the world with Nazi war criminals. And we're going to ask this question. How far would the CIA go to cover up? Would the CIA think twice about murder, torture? Well, we've seen Senator Church, the Democrat senator from 1975, worried about surveillance and intelligence, monitoring people. How far would they go monitoring people? Seems like we have an elephant in the room here that started back with the Patriot Act that needs to be addressed. But here's a question. Would the CIA go as far as murdering a U.S. sitting president? Let's watch this next clip.
So for 59 years, the U.S. government has held in secret a trove of documents that might explain what exactly happened on November 22nd, 1963. The CIA has pushed to keep those files secret. They are still secret, even as of yesterday. Thousands of them remain in government custody. We can't know. Why is that? Is there a benign explanation for it? Well, of course, there isn't. We spoke to someone who had accessed those documents who said that they show the CIA was directly involved in the murder of an American president. If that's not true, someone should correct us, but no one has. We heard from the intel community today, and what we heard was, whoever told you that broke the law by telling you that. But no one denied that it was true. Larry Schnapf is one of the reasons we saw what we have seen so far. He's been pushing hard for more documents. He's an
Yesterday was very disappointing, frustrating, and infuriating because essentially what we got yesterday was old wine packaged in new bottles. The 13,000 records that were released yesterday were basically records that had already been released, and there may be some less redactions. So the spin that the CIA is doing, and unfortunately the New York Times and the Washington Post have took it hook, line, and sinker. There are still, this was a big nothing burger yesterday. And this is particularly frustrating to my group because we spent the last year pressing President Biden to do the right thing and stop this obstruction that's been going on for 59 years. When Congress passed the JFK Records Act in 1992, they said time had passed, that all records should have a presumption of disclosure, and that records should be done expeditiously. A records review board was established. They spent 4 years scouring the federal government for files. They put them in a collection in the National Archives. While they were time limited in 1998, their work remains. And nothing has been really done since 1998. So we also this year tried to get Carolyn Maloney, the chair of the Oversight Committee, to hold a hearing on why the executive branch is not complying with the Records Act. And I got to tell you, the reason I came on tonight, one of the reasons, is because you and your viewers are in a unique position. Now that the House is going to be taken over by Congress, James Comer is going to be in charge of the Oversight Committee. And I think that we have to put pressure on him to hold an oversight hearing where he will call in for public testimony the CIA, the FBI, the trustee of the RFK family trust that's holding records back, and NBC, who has records, assassination records, that they have refused to release to the ARB, the Assassinations Review Board.
Really quickly, why would NBC be sitting on documents they refuse to release?
So Judge Sondheim, who was the chair of the review board, told a story last week that the review board contacted Walter Sheridan, who was the right-hand man for Robert Kennedy, and they wanted his records. He worked with Bobby Kennedy when Bobby Kennedy was Department of Justice. He also did some secret investigation by Bobby after the assassination. His records were up at the JFK library. As soon as he was asked for these records, he went up to the JFK library, grabbed them, delivered them to NBC in New York. And he had been hired by NBC in the late 60s to monitor the Jim Garrison trial, which was the impetus for the JFK movie. And NBC took possession of those records and refused to give them to the ARB. And to show you the level of obstruction in our government, the ARB, the review board, prepared a subpoena to serve on NBC, and they refused to. The Department of Justice refused to serve it.
It's all beyond belief. And the more details you learn, the more shocking it is. Professor, I appreciate your work on this and for coming on tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So one really fast, in fact, immediate way to answer these questions would be to speak to someone who ran the CIA. As it happens, we know someone who ran the CIA. His name is Mike Pompeo. We like him and we respect him. He's very smart. And so we've asked him 2 days in a row, please come on the show and answer a very simple question. Was the CIA involved in the murder of a U.S. president? We have spoken to someone fairly definitively who said, yes, the CIA was involved. And Mike Pompeo, for the second day in a row, refused to come on the show. We think that's odd, and we hope he'll reconsider.
Former attorney for President Trump and also former New York City mayor. There he is, my friend, Rudy Giuliani. Rudy, wow, especially this last one that dropped just a couple hours ago.
Yeah.
It shows a concerted effort to go after President Trump, and not even just tying it necessarily to January 6th. They were looking to get him, and they were clearly suppressing even like the week before the election.
Well, you know, I've been living with this for 3.5 years when I first put out the information about Biden's bribery in Ukraine. And I lived through that. I got up every morning from the first moment I got that hard drive saying to myself, how can I get this to my fellow citizens? Because you just read just a little bit of it and you realize the candidate of the Democrat Party was a lifelong criminal. And I mean, there are 50, 60 crimes outlined there. And I'm not saying that lightly. I'm not.
By the way, I can't wait to see what the Republicans uncover too. Being able to get records.
I think these guys. This is not the Senate. This is not the weak, frightened, except for Johnson and Grassley Senate, who could have revealed this, several years ago. I had this whole thing basically, or let's say half of it, certainly enough to prosecute in 2019. I gave it to Hannity in early 2019. Then to John Solomon, then to Mike Pompeo, who also buried it. And you should know that now that he's running for president. And I'll tell you the whole story of that at some point. I'll write it out. And then Barr buried it in January of 2020. And I didn't know that Barr had the hard drive.
Well, hopefully it doesn't get buried starting.
So, did you like that Rudy twist at the end? We had to add that. But before we get into that, let's go back to the beginning, where they released old records, just rehashed them, and re-released them. A few less redactions, nothing significant. The media covered up immediately for the CIA, just like the New York Times did for that good Nazi doctor. Now we have even more cover-ups. We put the Rudy part into it because what is in that file? Mike Pompeo was the head of the CIA when Trump turned around and he was going to release the documents. He said he would, the JFK files, all of them. And someone convinced him not to. Trump said it would be too devastating to release all the documents. But devastating to who is the question. Now let's look at what Rudy exposed. He exposed the deep state, the media, and the former head of the CIA. He told you. He turned around and gave the documents he had on the Biden laptop to AG Bill Barr. We didn't know already had them. Pompeo, the former head of the CIA at that time, he was Secretary of State under Trump. Now he wants to run for president, and he even gave him to Hannity in the media, who dummied right up, Mr. Tough conservative guy, always boasting on his show about how he's a beast with a firearm, he knows kung fu, he's a big butt boy, he doesn't want to risk his career, and he's afraid to cross somebody. Oh, we have to wait and see what Rudy comes out with on that. But now let's take a deeper dive into the JFK assassination with the dark journalist. He's been covering the JFK files for a long, long time. And let's take another look at Operation Paperclip. If there's any glitches in the video, I'm sorry, we got some problems, but bear with us and watch. It's important. Roll.
But the actual X-Protect aerospace angle and why Kennedy was assassinated was because he was all in on this and he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, because what they were setting up was a gigantic space grid to control the globe from space. This was their goal, the whole point. And this program does go very far back, right into the Nazi regime. And in fact, Kennedy became aware that in our space program, we were utilizing those very same Nazis, but that they came over with the same Marshall philosophy. And what Kennedy may have or may not have realized was that when he was leaning into smashing the CIA structure, he was smashing into that nest of former Nazis and this runaway, breakaway aerospace aspect. Now, this gets into intelligence, and that's the corridor between the defense contractors on the aerospace side and the intelligence agencies on the other. One is a private-public piece, so they're associated with the government. That is, I'm a defense contractor for the government, but I'm also a private company. And the other is at the behest of the government, the Central Intelligence Agency. But the Central Intelligence Agency serves a larger structure. Remember, it was born out of an S&C law firm. You know, that's where Dulles came from. And New York at that point was the jumping off point for international finance. That's what we're talking about when we're getting into the Central Intelligence Agency. So its actual function was to gather intelligence for the president. What it turned into was using the American military might and presence in the world for specific interests, moneyed interests, oil interests, aerospace interests. That's what the push and pull became. And Kennedy, unlike a lot of presidents, was very aware of those business forces. His dad was so deep in business, and we have to remember, let's take this history back to Boston for a minute, which is where the Kennedys came from. Joe Kennedy was working on a port during World War I in East Boston, and they were making there armaments and things for World War I. And who did he meet there but someone who was an assistant secretary of the Navy, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is, a long, long history. Into 1918, you really start to get the essence of what the Kennedys knew. And as Joe Kennedy moves up through that Wall Street world, doing a lot of very kind of, shady Wall Street stuff, he moves into all kinds of positions to the point where he becomes a Democratic power broker by 1929 when the Depression happens. When Roosevelt gets in the early 30s, he appoints him to head up the new SEC, which is to control all this crazy short selling that created the bubble and then burst and we got the Depression. So Joe Kennedy knows all about business, but the other thing that he knows all about is all about Hollywood. And in fact, he owns his own studios, he owns his own theaters, and he has his hands in real estate, alcohol, shipping. This guy is through it all. So his sons, when they're coming up, they share in all that knowledge. And when we get to Jack, he in particular is particularly book smart. He absorbs these things and he's a speed reader too. So, one of the things that Jack doesn't want to do is go into politics, interestingly enough. And his brother Joe is meant to go into politics and take on this role. Joe will die during World War II in a secret mission. And John will become his father's kind of main object. The father himself was planning to run against Roosevelt, interestingly enough, in 1940. But in 1938, he made some comments that seemed like they were wishy-washy against fascism. And then during the Battle of Britain, he starts to speak in a fashion which would suggest that he is very pessimistic about England's chances in the war. And Roosevelt yanks him, and he's thought of as an appeaser. And this is very hard. Joe basically realizes, oh, I'm shot, I'll never be president, but I'm going to funnel all of that interest and, that focus I have to be president into my sons. And in fact, it's John who picks up the mantle. But John also has a unique friendship with the first defense secretary of the United States, and that is James Forrestal. Forrestal is a Catholic like Kennedy is, and they develop a very interesting friendship. And what happens is Forrestal says, you know what, I'm going to take you after World War II, I'm going to take you to see the ruins in Berlin. You can write one of your stories. You're such a great journalist now. And Kennedy has just written a book called Why England Slept, which is all about the rise of Hitler and why England didn't do anything about it, and this whole thing. So his trajectory is actually to be a writer, interestingly enough. And but when he's over there, and there are all these pictures of him with Forrestal. Forrestal, as we learn later, becomes part of the MJ-12 group overlooking the UFO file. He will be pushed out of a window at Bethesda Naval Hospital in 1949, just a short period of time into being Secretary of Defense. They said it was exhaustion, and there's a number of very good book and analyses on what happened to Forrestal, actually. But in any case, and I have to stress this, that so many of the deep state researchers want to solve the Kennedy assassination, and they don't work with each other's information. Look at a Washington Post reporter who discovers a secret CIA agent that no one knew about and puts him on the record. And as a matter of fact, he wasn't even included in the trove of documents that were to come out because no one knew the guy existed. But he was the psychological operations manager of the Oswald Project, which is absolutely important. And he was our top psychological warfare officer. His name is George Joanides, and he is one of the major keys to the Kennedy assassination. We're going to get interesting things that came out we're going to report upon. I'm going to be looking at those files all weekend, but it appears to me that there's a couple of things that we can extrapolate out from what they released. Of course, they left out the most important stuff and the files that researchers have been demanding for years, 4 decades. And there's 44 files around George Joanides and the CIA operation to create Oswald. Those are the files that need to come out.
There you go. Let's take that apart. So did JFK know too much because of his family's background and their connections? Joe Kennedy goes all the way back to Roosevelt, who was Secretary of the Navy at that time. Then Kennedy understands that they want to set up a space grid while he's president to control the planet. I'll think back to what Senator Church was cautioning everybody about in 1975, years later. No, are we awake yet? Well, think about this. Would the Secretary of the Navy, Forrestal, just kind of fall out a window? Or was he pushed out, a plan by the CIA, because there was something there he didn't want to come out? What was really going on? Who were the unknown players? And all this aero technology that was involved at that time that no one knew much about. But let's go a little further into it and look into what he was talking about. There was something called the Oswald file, and Oswald was created by the CIA. Let's hear a little bit more.
And by the way, there's someone who is still living who can answer a lot of these questions. And I really want to get this across, that either this person should come forward or Congress should subpoena them to get this information out. And he might not like being put on the spot, but, you know, he said some very interesting things before, so maybe we can get him on the record. But he's about 90 years old now. So we'll see if he will. So the basic glow from today, everyone was saying, you know, Newsweek and all these others, the secret JFK assassination files are finally here. And the general buzz was, well, President Biden couldn't let out some records because of national security, but here's all this other stuff. And that was basically the name of the game. So the general take, for example, Newsweek, here's the CIA spokesperson on why they couldn't release the CIA records, the majority of them. CIA spokesperson said in comments shared with Newsweek that the agency is committed to the JFK Act's goal of ensuring maximum transparency with respect to the government records concerning President Kennedy's assassination. By the way, it's not the spirit of the JFK Act, it's a law. The Central Intelligence Agency is in violation of the law ever since 2017, because the records had 25 years to come out by law. That's a congressional law. It's been passed, signed off on by the president. So the conversation about this should be over, but here we go, more fluff. Now the Mary Farrell Foundation has a lawsuit, and we do get into their comments. The agency worked in close collaboration with the National Archives to review the files over the last year and release thousands of additional documents in full. Yeah, fluff documents. The spokesperson said other documents were released with fewer redactions, and no documents remain fully redacted or withheld in their entirety. The spokesman reiterated Burns, who's the director now, Director Burns' previous statement that all of the CIA information directly related to the Kennedy assassination was previously released, and said, as of Thursday, 95% of all CIA documents related to the assassination have been released in their entirety. This is actually such a bold-faced lie. And the core files, the one that we're looking for, again, 93% of those have not been released. Only 7% of them have. As for Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who fatally shot Kennedy, the spokesperson said, I'm not aware of any documents known to be directly related to Oswald that have not already been made part of the collection. Oh yeah? How about the Joe Anidis files, which are completely secret, and he's the one who created the Oswald Project? Do you think that those records might be related? Okay, conspiracy theories about the assassination have continued to spread. All those terrible conspiracy theories, you know, the ones that use facts. Some theorists have questioned whether the CIA or the government had any connection with Oswald. Well, they don't have to question it because we have records of CIA people tracking Oswald. And now there are records that are going to be coming out in January, which are related to a lawsuit. And the idea is they're going to show and expose the CIA directly created the Oswald Project. Now, the official word, are you ready? CIA never engaged Oswald. The spokesperson said CIA information regarding Oswald, including Oswald's visit to Mexico City, was included in prior releases. There's no new information on this topic in the 2022 release. Well, that's the whole reason for the 2022 release, is to release the Joe Anidis Oswald files. If you don't do that, then the whole thing is just a PR exercise. President Biden postpones disclosure of some files. President Joe Biden said he's releasing most, but not all, of the 16,000 records related to the John F. Kennedy assassination. Now, I want to point this out. If I say to you, I have 16,000 records, each record may contain up to 10,000 documents. So, in fact, if I say to you, I have 16,000 records, and each one has approximately somewhere 5,000 to 10,000 documents each, what number of documents are we actually talking about? So it's an easy figure to just float around and say, well, there's only 16,000 left. Don't worry about it. This significant disclosure reflects my administration's commitment to transparency and will provide the American public with greater insight and understanding the government's investigation into this tragic event, Stepper Biden said. Thursday afternoon, agencies in the National Archives did, however, identify a limited number of records that contain information that should continue to be classified, and Biden agrees. Okay.
Okay. Lies. Would the CIA lie to the people? Would they oppose a law by Congress to release all the documents. Here's the next question. Is the CIA above the law? Well, that's why it's important what we showed you in clip 1. The Oswald Project. They actually have documents showing about it. They claim there was no Oswald Project. The CIA had nothing to do with Oswald. It keeps getting better and better. I mean, you know, all records are supposed to be released by now. And then DJ brings up a quite interesting fact here is if there's only 16,000 files left, how many thousands of documents are in those files that they don't want to release? You know, all this proves Murray is known all along. This is a damn cover up, and it will continue to be. But here's where the real question comes in. Because this is no longer just about JFK. The question is why? Because it's apparent from all the evidence that we already have that a beast has taken control of our government. That's a direct threat to we the people's well-being. And you'll see more on that in our final segment. But with that being said, let's here you're gonna have some problems, I think, with audio and visual. But let's play this next segment we got for you.
About a week before this actual release, all these articles were buzzing about, hey, you know, there's this incredible new information about the CIA and Oswald. But that wasn't the official stuff. That was just Jeff Morley talking at a press thing about his research. So they did a weird crisscross there in case people weren't paying attention so that people would think, oh yeah, you know, they released these records, we're all set. But when the actual records release came up about today, no Oswald, no CIA, forget all about it. So they were able to do this weird two-step. And those are the types of operations that we watch that go on in the media with these types of releases. Okay, now here's the Mary Farrell Foundation's position on this. The foundation says the timing of their lawsuit is coincidental to Trump's fight over classified records with the Justice Department and the National Archives, an agency that's seldom in the news, but now plays a central role in the investigation of records stored at Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Florida after he left office. JFK assassination historian David Talbot, who wrote a quite remarkable book called The Devil's Chessboard about the Central Intelligence Agency, but he's a Trump critic. He sees an irony in the two cases. Quote, they decided to pillory Trump over this issue because he's a political enemy, but they're guilty of violating records laws themselves with the JFK Records Act. Trump took documents the federal government owned, but they're sitting on documents that belong to the American people. Exactly. And I put this across when it came to the Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon thing, where they said, hey, we've got this secret UFO stuff and we just grabbed it out of the government and here it is, you know. Well, obviously, if classification rules were real, like the ones they busted Trump over at Mar-a-Lago, then they would have grabbed Elizondo, CIA agent, and Mellon, and intelligence veteran, you know. So come on. This is just a selective game of whenever they want to go after somebody, they'll have a good reason. But I think it's an interesting point that he makes here. Interestingly enough, a spokesman for Trump declined to comment. There's a weird thing here about Trump and these records. And again, when he showed up today saying, I'm going to make a big announcement, and it was on the same day as the JFK records, you have to wonder in that two-step around Mar-a-Lago if he isn't trying to scare that structure that's trying to basically put him in prison by saying, you don't know what files I have. Maybe I have copies of those JFK files that you're hiding. I've pointed out the conversation that took place between Judge Napolitano and President Trump as President Trump was leaving office. And this is when Napolitano and Trump were still friends. And he's been on record now, Judge Napolitano, who's been all over the place, you know, for years as this libertarian judge and celebrated in all these legal places. He was a commentator on Fox News, and you know, he's very well known. And so he goes into this conversation that he had with Trump before he left office, and he said, "Why didn't you let out the presidential records around the JFK assassination? You said you would." And Trump said, "I can't do it." And he said, "What do you mean you can't treat the American people like children? You have to do this. People are counting on you." And he said, "You don't understand. If you saw what was in there, Andrew, you couldn't release it. Basically, it would destroy everything." That's what Trump said about those records. Interestingly enough, there's never been a bigger dance around deep state records in the United States government than the JFK records. I'm inclined to believe that it was Bobby Kennedy, right after the Kennedy assassination, who somehow put something on the record inside of that JFK archive. And that's why we have the problem getting these records, because the CIA realizes that it couldn't rub out whatever it is he left behind. And Bobby Kennedy was just the type, because immediately after the assassination, he summoned the head of the CIA, and they were in conference for 2 hours. So there's something going on there with those records that Trump, looking at them, said, "Oh my God." And that's about as close of a glimpse as we're going to get to it, because Napolitano and Trump were friends, and Trump was talking to him off the cuff. And Napolitano says to this day, "I want to know what it was that he was looking at," but he doesn't know. I'm going to get into what that most likely is. A little more on Mary Farrell. Okay. Oh, here's the other thing that the CIA said. Now, the new government position is agencies have until May 1st, 2023 to review the remaining redactions in the records and determine if they should be disclosed to the public. Continued postponement after that date will only happen if necessary to protect against harm, military defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or the embarrassment of the Central Intelligence Agency assassinating their own president. Everything is going through this funnel of the Central Intelligence Agency, and guess what? When you get into the space programs and Space Force and all the rest of it, all the people are intelligence people. Kennedy records are 60 years old. If the CIA was clean in relation to it, they'd release the whole thing. That's just a matter of fact.
Let's know. I wonder.
There you go. So what have we got? What have we got to unwind there? Think about this. What did RFK discuss with the CIA? And what is this with Mar-a-Lago? It's an interesting point he made about Trump's announcement. Was to challenge the CIA into thinking that Trump has a copy of the JFK files. I mean, they actually used a little-known archives agency to go in there and make all these claims. So what is it there? I mean, we know Trump had ties with the Kennedy family. Is he really defending himself from the CIA, or is it really that devastating? But the question still comes up again. Who would this truth be devastating to? We already know all the historic facts that are available readily. You can get them anywhere. We'll give you a link to that show we used in part 1, that this is being violated everywhere. And I say it still comes down to the Patriot Act, the elephant in the room. But let's move a little more, because I think we have a little more. But DJ makes a great case, because if the CIA was clean, why wouldn't they release the whole thing? But there's more. There's an LBJ letter. Listen up. Roll it.
Why Bobby didn't immediately go after the deep state after JFK's assassination.
Well, I mean, Bobby was Attorney General. What did he do? He ran for Senate immediately, because the FBI knew, oh, we don't have to cooperate with him anymore. His brother's dead, and LBJ was his bitter enemy. So you don't really have those resources in the government to do anything. But he continued investigating all those years that he was senator. And after he'd investigated for 4 years, what does he say? I'm going to run for president. Well, the best revenge is to institute President Kennedy's policies as president, which he was going to do. And he was assassinated, but not until LBJ got out of the race, because LBJ wasn't going to sit around and say, you know what, I'm not going to sit here and, be the recipient of 2 Kennedy deaths. that's going to look too suspicious. People are going to look at my role in it, and I'm already looking dicey enough. One thing I think that's important to remark on also when we think about LBJ is that LBJ blackmailed himself onto the ticket, which is very interesting if you get into it. And the Kennedys didn't want him on there. But this is where he pulled strings with J. Edgar Hoover and others. And he was going to, according to Kennedy's secretary, drop some very personal things about John Kennedy. And he had already used very dirty tactics, breaking into Kennedy's doctor's files and trying to, get any dirt medically that he could on JFK. So LBJ was, just a dirty operator, and that's what the deep state needed. However, here's a weird fate twist about LBJ. There's two things, actually. One, if he hadn't been in there, then the Kennedys may not have carried Texas, and so Kennedy may not have become president. So there may have been a reason in the great, scheme of things for LBJ to be there. The other thing is that after he left office in 1969, he gave an interview with Walter Cronkite where he said, well, I don't believe the Warren Commission, and I don't believe that Oswald acted alone. As soon as the interview was over, he called the news office and said, don't run it. But we still have the footage of him saying it. So he wanted himself on the record. There's another twist with LBJ, and it comes up next year. You want to know what it is? It's an X letter, and it's at the LBJ library. It's sitting there, and it is 75 pages in a letter, and the letter is just X, and it's not to be opened.
What do you mean the letter is just X? That's what it says on the...
It's the X letter.
Okay.
That's what it is. It's definitely related to the X technology.
Wow.
And this entire subject. Now, here's what he said. This letter to be released 50 years after my death. Well, he died in January of 1973. What is 50 years after his death? It's January of 2023. The LBJ library, where are you? Are you getting ready? Are you going to block that the way the CIA blocked the Joe and Eddie's records? This is interesting. For years, historians have wondered, what's in that, And right after Nixon died, they were so curious that someone convinced the person who was headed up the LBJ library to open it. And he opened and looked at 2 pages, and they were immediately classified. So whatever it is, it's hot stuff. And, I don't think it has anything to do with Nixon. I think it's related directly to this. And I've put this on the record before that there's a number of stealth archives all over the place. And stealth archives is very simple. It's like these JFK records. We know the Joe and Eddie's records exist. We know the CIA holds them. We know that they contain explosive information, but we can't get our hands on them. That's a stealth archive. We're aware of it, but we can't get our hands on it. Now the LBJ letter is sitting there, and I believe that they will. I think that, they're in a position to do it, but they might experience some official interference if they go to release that letter and say, well, we need to hold off for another 20 years and just, wait till these generations die off and forget about it. And then look back 100 years later and say, we were in a tough spot because it was the Cold War and the CIA had to kill Kennedy. And, this is the basic thing. But right now, as it stands, the historical book is distorted. So the reality is upside down because the same group that's operating and taking control on so many different levels, including health levels now, direct from the government, is the same power source, the covert power source that took over in 1963. Professor Peter Dale Scott calls it the first deep state revolt against the White House. That's how I think we need to look at it.
3% of we're going to release all these documents on the Kennedy assassination, except for this 3%. I take it this would be damning evidence the CIA is up to its neck in this.
It's it's most of the stuff that they're concerned about at this juncture was that the evidence in our possession that was classified, not only by myself but John JFK Jr., and the information that was going back and forth between the executive branch and the White House and the CIA at that time for the direction of this, especially these two meetings in the White House and ONI direction that was taking place at that time. That box 4 out of Kim Hurd. Kim Hurd's an attorney. It was the representative that went before the back and forth between Bill Clinton, his advisor, back and forth to the ARB. That box number 4 is missing from the National Archives. I can guarantee the American public. I can't get it. I've written them, pushed them, had people go to the archive. The archives responded that the box is missing and that they don't have a pull slip for it. They don't know whether the CIA or George Bush himself had removed it. The American people are not being given the information.
Can you answer this question as to what was in the sealed document from RFK that Evelyn Lincoln presented in a court and was presented in a court after she died?
One of these things was the autopsy material that was signed over by Berkeley to him that showed a different scenario of the shooting itself. Another was a document filed by the AG at the AGs of Texas on the 26th of November, showing LBJ complicit in the murder, asking for his removal and an immediate provisional government.
Oh my gosh. Christopher Fulton, this is not enough time to speak with you. I cordially invite you to come back on the program and
Wow. Seems like there's quite a bit there. We have the LBJ letter, better known as the X letter. Someone got to look at two of the 75 pages and they immediately classified and sealed it right back up. Now we have the RFK information. So these are two different sources, but actually several. DJ refers to a lot. This guy, Chris Dolan, his book, The Inheritance, he was on with John B. Wells, so we did a clipping in that. You can find him on Twitter. We'll give you the link in the description of the video. And you can see he hasn't been saying much, but he does have links to his material that he did. Now the Twitter's alive, we'll see what happens. But it appears everybody who's high up in government seems to have dirt to be used against them. That's how JFK got on the ticket. I mean, how LBJ got on the ticket with JFK. And you really got to start thinking about this, because if you go back to what the CIA was searching out with the Nazis, if you watch part one, they wanted war criminals that they had leverage over because they had dirt on them and could prosecute them at any time. And there's another little tidbit in there DJ said about how all these files can now be buried and all be buried. And he even mentioned the health authority that they have over we the people. I'm not sure who these people are, but these people don't have the authority they believe over we the people, according to our founding documents. And it's time to get back to them. Now let's take a big leap forward here and on this last clip of the segment for you.
Really censor that public because they're talking about COVID and they're making all these, misnomers and things. That's misinformation. We're going to sanction them, and that gives us the right to shut down their conversation on the internet. It's not true. Misinformation is something that the Central Intelligence Agency is great at, and they're spreading that through the media, I mean, the media depends for their news, especially news about things that are happening overseas. Ukraine, hello? That's all Central Intelligence Agency. They write the news releases, they give it back. What's somebody at the New York Times going to do? They're under orders from their publisher to take what the Central Intelligence Agency says. We have no idea what's going on over there. And the Kennedy assassination, they just want it to fade from memory, but what's happening instead is generation to generation, it keeps picking up. They thought they'd get over it. Well, the recent poll on the JFK assassination is that 71% of the public doesn't believe the official story, and they don't believe that Oswald acted alone, i.e. the Central Intelligence Agency disinformation campaign failed. So where do you go from there? Because then the public is looking at the government, and the government doesn't look so legitimate because they're still hiding something from 60 years ago. Who's the central responsible agent that is holding those records? The National Archives and the Central Intelligence Agency. Well, if the Central Intelligence Agency isn't giving you the truth, and obviously they're not, then we shouldn't trust them in all these other areas, like getting us into a nuclear war in Ukraine. 44 of these Central important records that were supposed to be released didn't come out today, and there's a reason for that. Those records pertain directly to how the Central Intelligence Agency set up the Oswald project. The official story around Oswald is, he comes from a poverty-stricken family. He has a low education. He joined the Marines because he had a terrible life. Well, it's interesting because he speaks several languages. That's pretty interesting. He travels the world. He has a top security clearance for the highest priority project in the United States, the U-2, when he's at Atsugi in Japan. That's 1959. And Oswald was born in 39. So at 20 years old, he's pretty well accomplished already. He also studied at one of the major Army language training schools in California. So this is not, a run-of-the-mill person. The fact that he can go to Russia in that era, when really no Americans were in Russia, establish himself there, speak Russian so well that when he meets his wife, she thinks he's a Russian, significant. The problem is with the whole Farrell Foundation and Morley approach is that their whole thing is the CIA is covering up that they were involved in this Oswald psychological operation thing. They're not saying the CIA was involved in murdering President Kennedy. They won't go there with it. That's a problem because the Central Intelligence Agency created the Oswald project in order to kill President Kennedy and then get away with it and set up Oswald as the patsy. He's the CIA patsy, as I said in my documentary. So that's where I think that line needs to go in order to get the public to understand what they're trying to do. And the deep state researchers who deal with things like government assassination need to allow for the fact that a lot of these things are motivated by an entirely secret structure that's dealing with an exotic technology in the aerospace secret corridor between the defense contractors and intelligence. This is the piece that's missing. And that's what there's only a few things that somebody could absolutely not release records over. And it's not that the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. They're hiding that. But basically, in all those polls after polls, Americans believe that the CIA killed President Kennedy. And there's a reason for that, because researchers have brought that forward, actual researchers who are called conspiracy theorists. And then, like in the traditional dark journalism rules, there's junk conspiracy under that. Yes, like, oh, the driver shot him and all this kind of stuff.
Or Jackie.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
So those are supposed to be catchy stories to, throw off regular people who are looking into this. And they get involved with that and they say, I don't want to do it. Oswald, when he comes back from the Soviet Union, he stays with Michael Paine. Michael Paine is the protege of Walter Dornberger, who's the Nazi rocket scientist, who was in charge of von Braun and saved from the judgment at Nuremberg because von Braun said, I need him to make this work. And so he was saved because of crimes against humanity by using slave labor to build the V-2 rockets. It's undeniable. If you go just an inch deep, it's undeniable. And so the fluff on top about, angry Cubans and mafia people or whatever, that's really scenery. The deeper core is Kennedy represents a threat to the establishment, and he's changing the world order. And for them, they want to build, what's their goal? The goal of this organization, X-Protect, with the deep state, the Central Intelligence Agency, is to build a space infrastructure to control things on the ground. That's what they've been after from the beginning. So if Kennedy is about, I'm going to bring the Russians up to the moon with us, and there's no weapons in space, by the way, and that's a threat to everything that they're doing. Because this is the impasse that we're at. It's why we're in a culture of a kind of schizophrenic values. It's because the top is operating on this level and doing their own thing. I mean, we see so many mind games in relation to the financial aspect, the FTX scandal and, the deep state operating in these different areas, very often in the hot zone, and incredibly accruing wealth and defrauding investors and then letting these people off with a, in this case, actually, Bankman-Fried was arrested recently. We'll see how far this gets. But, I think in general, there's a lot of financial malfeasance that we see over and over again. If we could go one level deeper underneath that, then we would see that there's a structure that's operating and needs those slush funds. So it targets different areas. It targets pharmaceuticals. It targets cryptocurrencies. When we get into this, we start to move in a real way and say, there's a reason why they're trying to bring about this order the way that they're doing it, this kind of transhumanist piece, but they need it, they need these different levels of funding to do it. And some of those corridors of funding have got to be publicly found out, like the FTX thing. So like Enron, we've seen this movie before, BCCI and others. It's a repeat pattern. And Professor Scott described it to me, and he said, well, this structure, this system of the deep state, what it does through a deep event, like the Kennedy assassination or Watergate or Iran-Contra, the financial coup d'etat of 2008, the COVID op, 9/11, whatever it is, it steps in and it creates a deep event, and that changes all this policy. What do we get after 9/11? We're under emergency rules, right? You're under emergency powers. Since when? It's America. The continuity of government people are all elevated. They're ready to take over. And, the COG structure, who really knows that much about it? I've studied it. Professor Scott studied it. William Arkin, the guy who got me banned from Newsweek, studied it. I must have said something wrong. This is very interesting to me because there's something about COG which is untouchable. But, when I've gone into looking at the space aspect and the space secrecy, the secret space program and things of this nature, I found that same secrecy level applies. That's why you get 50 years of no return to the moon, but there's no official comment about that. Well, they wanted to send up shuttles instead. No, you have a moon program you've invested in and created a whole NASA over, and then you don't go back for 50 years. There's a reason, and we're not told what that reason is.
Yep. There's a lot of things that we're not told what the reasons is, not just why we didn't go back to the moon. But DJ pretty much nails it there. The media is just a voice piece for the CIA. They tell you what the CIA wants you to know. So much for the First Amendment. The CIA used the archives agencies as their allies to try to see what Trump got. But the interesting part is when it gets into the Oswald project, how they try to portray Oswald as some poor, unfortunate human being who by the time of 20 has top secret clearance, speaks multiple languages. And we came back to the US. It was rooming with the connection to the Nazi rocket scientists. So, I don't know. The other part that really, and we've seen this in previous shows with, we did on Ukraine and the one with Nikita Khrushchev, how we're almost at the brink of war so many times. Kennedy actually wanted to work with the Russians to get to the moon, which makes me think, and there could be a connection here, which pretty much, I don't think these are conspiracy theories anymore, but there's a battle going on between the fascists and the communists. That's why he keeps mentioning the Ukraine. So what's really going on? What is flowing? What are they afraid to let flow out? How far would the CIA go? And our last question should be, after you watch the first two parts, who exactly is the CIA? Part 3, we're going to get down to more of the medical end of what was taking place. Stay tuned for the awakening.